About, I don't know, a month or so ago, Scott asked me if I'd talk a little bit about our journey as a fellowship from the legalism in our past to cultivating more of a culture of grace. It's easy to just experience what you just experienced in the last 10 minutes and have no idea the journey we've been on to get there. Have you ever thought about the fact that when the Old Testament closes, there's no Sanhedrin, there's no Pharisees, there's no Sadducees, there's no synagogue, there's very little talk of the scribes. And yet, when the New Testament opens, they dominate the conversation and the relationship with Jesus. When the Hebrew people came back from captivity, most of them no longer spoke the Hebrew language. They had no idea who they really were as the people of God. They had no idea what was in their scriptures. And little by little, they began to understand they were actually living in the fulfillment of what the prophets prophesied. So they had this excitement in learning who we are as the people of God. What are our scriptures? What do our scriptures say? So there was a group of people called the scribes who still spoke the Hebrew language. And they became those that would read the scriptures to the people. They had to have a place to do that, so the synagogue. The Pharisees were a zealous, well-intended group of religious leaders that wanted to zealously seek to be the people of God. By the time you get to the Gospels, they dominate the landscape because over time, people would ask, well, how do we do this? How do we keep the Sabbath? How do we do this? How do we do that? So they would explain, well, you do this, and you do this, and you do that, which became known as the oral law. And over time, the oral law, the prescriptions, the opinions of these religious leaders became much more the focus than the scriptures themselves. And it's a bit sobering to realize that when the Messiah finally walked among them, they're the ones that pushed to have him put to death. It's worth thinking about that 20 years after the resurrection of Jesus, Paul felt it necessary to write an entire letter addressing this topic of legalism. I'm convinced the number one concern of the New Testament writers for his church was legalism. It always starts with a great deal of zeal, well-intended people wanting to be the people of God, but that zeal turns into prescriptions and opinions of exactly what this looks like until that's much more the focus than the actual scriptures themselves. It is not possible for anyone to have roots into the Berean fellowship as far back as I have. My grandfather was actually one of the 5 founding elders of this church. He precedes Dr. Olson. This church then became the launching pad for what we know today as the Berean Fellowship. As a matter of fact, from the outside, you can see the old stone building. My grandfather built that building with his own 2 hands. So I have a lot of roots. They were concerned about the rise of modernism and wanted to start a church that would be dedicated to the authority of Scripture. They were zealous to be the people of God. This fellowship was launched by godly, well-meaning, Jesus-loving people. These are people that made it possible for us to have what we have today. These were godly men and women. Many of them I knew personally. They knew me, they loved me, they believed in me, they supported me, and they've taught me a great deal. I have nothing for respect for these people, but we have to be honest that in their zeal, somewhere along the way, they began to lose their way. In order to walk this path to be pleasing to God, it started to be more and more their prescriptions. This is how you do it, their opinions. This is what it looks like. And over time, what happens is those rules, those prescriptions, those opinions become much more the focus than the scriptures themselves. What you end up with in our churches are people that know the rules, but they could not open their Bibles and explain to you from the scripture why we live this way. So what you end up with is kind of a sense of a cold, dead religion rather than a love affair with Jesus. So it's been a journey for us as a fellowship to work our way through that, to not throw out the baby with the bathwater, to not let the pendulum swing clear to the other side, and ultimately to work toward cultivating a culture of grace. So I guess a good question would be, how do we move forward? It would be foolish for us to think those previous generations are the only ones that struggle with legalism, as if somehow they got messed up and we got it figured out. Legalism is one of those things that's very easy to see in everybody else. It's very hard to see in ourselves. Every generation has their own version of legalism. What they're legalistic about changes. But the younger generations today are just as legalistic as generations that have gone before them. The issues are just different. So how do we make sure we continue to move on a path of grace? Couple things. One is, I think we must have an absolutely unswerving commitment to rightly dividing the word of truth. We cannot have preachers who stand in the pulpit and state their prescriptions and their opinions and pull out verses to support their opinions. We have to be committed to rightly dividing the word of truth, because that's always going to expose our legalism. Second of all, we have to be a fellowship that is committed to understanding the difference between what is primary and what is secondary. We need to major on the majors, and we need to be the church, and we need to get the job done. And we need to have the humility to admit that there are some things in Scripture that aren't as clear as we wish they were. And recognize there are people just as godly as us, just as committed to the authority of Scripture, just as much in love with Jesus, who see some of these things different than we do. I am convinced that where the Bible is unclear, it's unclear on purpose. I don't think God has a communication problem. So we need to be absolutely clear on the fundamentals of our faith and be unwavering on those as the culture becomes more and more secular. But we also have to understand there are things that aren't as clear as we wish they were. and commit ourselves to be Bereans and to constantly search the scriptures to see what's true. I think if we do that, we will continue down a path of cultivating a culture of grace. If we're going to call ourselves Bereans, then we need to be committed to the authority of Scripture. We need to be the church. We need to get the job done. Thanks.